Welcome to this meeting, the shape of things to come, organized by CESPIC. CESPIC is the European Center of Peace Science, Integration Cooperation at Catholic University, Our Lady of Good Counsel in Tirana, the Gioia che ci temere. So even if we are not in Tirana at the moment, at least some of us is not in Tirana, is basically we are there. That's the point. So this is the first online meeting, and perhaps it will be the first one of a series that we'll disclose in the future. And before we start, I would like only to highlight a couple of technical points, even if now it appears a joke, because I was the first to be wrong in technical. But anyway, so mute yourself when the speakers are, where the guest, the speaker is speaking, and please turn off your video too. And the default setting of Google Meet is the highlights on, is the pinning of the speaker. So basically it's necessary you mute yourself and you don't activate your microphone, otherwise there would be some confusion in video streaming. Consider also that this meeting is now we are recording the meeting, and it will be available in the future on our YouTube channel. Let's go to the contents of this meeting. Of course, needless to say, we are living in a very extraordinary phase, because nobody could have expected so dramatic pandemic worldwide, but eventually it happened. So now the question is, what's going to happen afterwards? The world is going to face, or maybe some parts, some regions, some states in the world are going to face a very pervasive economic crisis, even a very pervasive crisis in political systems. And also international cooperation is really under stress, because it will be under stress because of the COVID pandemic. So with our guests today are trying to give some insights on this. So the title, which has been taken by a novel of the last century by A.G. Wells, The Shape of Things to Come, is the title trying to recall all this. So we have three guests: Professor Arzu Kibris from University of Warwick, Professor Mansoub Murshid from Institute of Social Studies in Netherlands and Coventry University in UK, and Professor Andrea Ruggeri from University of Oxford. They are all good friends of CESPIC and Gioia che ci temere, because they have been already in Tirana. So thanks for accepting again to take part into CESPIC activities and our university meetings. So I would start with Arzu, Professor Kibris, and the question is, Arzu Kibris is she's a professor in Warwick, UK, but she's also running a very important European project, which is focusing on the impact on societies of big shocks. So she's exactly the right person to reply to this first question. What's going to happen? What's going to happen with societies, with people, with democracy after this COVID pandemic? Floor is yours.
Professor Arzu, please activate the microphone, please.
Okay, you hear me now? Do you hear me
Yes.
now? Yeah. All right, sorry about that little tech mishap. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. And let me try to answer your question as best as I can. I'm not a psychic. I don't know really the shape of things to come, but I can only, I have some probabilistic assessments only. And as always, in order to be able to say something about the shape of things to come, we need to first have a clear understanding of the shape of things that happen, right? And that's not really as easy as it used to be, because you know, even though most of us are now spending our days connected to the internet, having these meetings and whatnot, in fact, our world used to be much more connected and we were much more aware of each other before this pandemic. We were part of a global network, in fact. Unfortunately, the virus seems to have disconnected a significant portion of the nodes of our global network. And we were so busy and terrified with keeping ourselves healthy and afloat that we didn't even realize the loss of connection or had the time to think about it. Moreover, in many cases, we in fact gave silent consent to this. And here's what happened in some of those nodes what happened in some of those nodes when we got disconnected from them. Following the outbreak of the coronavirus, parliaments were suspended or restricted in quite a few countries around the world. Now, open democracy is telling us that now more than 2 billion people live in countries where parliaments have been suspended or restricted. That's a huge number. These are pandemic power grabs, if you will, and these grabs are changing our world. In many parts of the world, this crisis has been used and is still being used, in fact, to roll back our rights and freedoms. And I'm not talking about having to wear masks or to stay home or social distancing, none of that. I'm talking about governments using this pandemic as an opportunity to grab power and to silence any opposition. I'm talking about ruling by decrees. I'm talking about distributing lucrative and dodgy contracts without any transparency, silencing of journalists and even doctors. And I'm talking about specifically targeting vulnerable communities. I'm talking about those with less power being put most at risk during this pandemic. I'm talking about the alarming increase of digital surveillance. Now, why am I talking about these? Well, I mean, by a sad turn of events, I ended up spending my corona days under lockdown in Turkey, and I found myself watching helplessly the assaults on what little remains of the Turkish people's rights, freedoms, and social welfare under the disguise of this pandemic. And that got me interested because I knew that if these were happening here in Turkey, they must be happening in other places too. So I started watching out for news on pandemic power grabs, and here's a small sample of what I have gathered so far. So let's start with Turkey. As I just said. So parliament is suspended here, and there are fake news laws enacted. What's a fake news law? So it's now a crime punishable by imprisonment to distribute fake or distorted information. But who decides what's fake or distorted? Yes, of course, the government. News channels are now receiving heavy fines, journalists are being detained. The High Council of Radio and TV Broadcasting, and there's such a council, a state censorship authority it is now considering banning TV news reporters from making comments while they present the news. Can you believe that? No comments, just present the news. The president ordered a change in the constitutional laws for bar and medical associations to put them under complete government control after receiving some criticism from these associations about the way this crisis has been managed. The parliament, as I said, is suspended, but still lucrative construction contracts are being awarded by the government, and no one knows the size or the terms of these contracts or how they're being awarded. Let's go to Hungary. I'm sure you heard about this. On March 30, the Hungarian parliament approved a law authorizing the government to manage the pandemic and its consequences by any means it deems necessary and proportionate. It's called the Enabling Act, and there are no time limits built into this legislation. No sunset clauses. So this is ruled by decree without any kind of time limit. So the ruling party has supermajority in the parliament in Hungary, so they passed this legislation with no problem whatsoever. There's no parliamentary oversight over the decrees to come. Wouldn't have made any difference if there had been provisions about the criminal code that make it a crime to distribute, again, fake or distorted information or any information that causes public alarm. Hundreds of procedures already raised against individuals for so-called fear-mongering. And the Prime Minister Orban said, we're fighting a two-front war. One front is called migration, and the other one belongs to the virus, coronavirus. And there is a logical connection between the two as both spread with movement. Let's go to Slovenia. The government used the emergency to bypass tender rules and award opaque contracts worth 80 million euros, including a 25 million deal for protective equipment to a gambling mogul with no healthcare experience. Romania, an emergency decree allowed removal of entire websites without any appeal. Serbia, the president again assumed the right to rule by decree. Colombia, in an open letter to UN mission, Defendamos la Paz, the country's most powerful peace organization, accused the president and his administration of using the pandemic to cover up violations of the 2016 peace deal with the now demobilized FARC rebels. Peru, a police protection law has been enacted exempting officers and soldiers from criminal responsibility for deaths or injuries caused during the state of emergency. Georgia, planned infrastructure projects will continue without public consultations following emergency legislation. Kenya, journalists have been arrested, rampant police brutality, reports about police shooting and beating people at markets or returning home from work without any apparent justification. Slovakia, Prime Minister Matovic announced forced virus testing on the Roma community. The army is to enter Roma settlements to test everyone in them, force anyone who tests positive into government-run facilities. Authorities in Romania and Bulgaria also introduced restrictions on Roma communities, sometimes using force. Thailand, any information about the virus that the government deems false or capable of causing fear is now punishable by up to 5 years in prison. That's another false information or fake information law. Philippines, arrests for spreading fake news about the virus. More than 20,000 people detained for lockdown violations, with some curfew violators confined to dog cages and made to sit in the midday sun. Reports about police brutality and targeting of vulnerable groups like the LGBT. Malaysia, activists arrested for alleged misinformation. Brazil, activists warn that Bolsonaro is using coronavirus to cover up assaults on the Amazon. South Africa, parliament suspended until further notice. Mongolia, criminal penalty for spreading false news about the virus. Israel, openly surveilling all residents using their mobile phone data to track those who tested positive for the coronavirus and determining who has come into contact with them. Prime Minister Netanyahu waived parliamentary oversight on using such anti-terrorism measures to tackle the pandemic. Now, you tell me the shape of things to come, because I think they're already here. And of all the times, this is when we, citizens, are in real need of scrutiny over government actions. But who is to do it? I've told you all about those fake news laws without any definition of what constitutes a fake news or any sunset clauses in them. Members of civil society organizations, journalists, activists are locked up, either in prison because of those fake news laws, or in their homes, just like you and me. It really doesn't have to be a choice between public health and individual liberties and rights, but in many places, unfortunately, it has become so. A couple weeks ago, the Westminster Foundation for Democracy issued a warning, and they said, there are significant risks that after the current emergency, people's rights will be permanently eroded and that power will end up more concentrated in fewer hands. So I'm just going to stop here. I'm sorry I wasn't able to give you a more positive outlook, but that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Okay, Arzu, excellent. Yes, your scenario appears to be a bit gloomy, but you couldn't keep from saying these kind of things. I say so. Okay, let's go to Professor Mansoub Murshid. Professor Mansoub Murshid from Coventry University and the Institute of Social Studies in Netherlands. So, Mansoub, you are an economist who knows perfectly the channels of economic development and the nightmare of scenarios characterized by inequality, unemployment, and all these risk factors. So what's going to happen after this pandemic?
Thank you very much. Am I audible? I hope I'm audible. I'm very happy to be in this meeting. I'm very honored to be part of CESPIC again. I would like to start with the certain historical analogies. You know, these kinds of pandemics and big upheavals have set the stage for systemic change in the past, or at least created the possibility. As an economist, you know, who's interested in economic systems as well, I can think of the 14th century pandemic in Europe, referred to as the Black Death in many parts, as giving a very strong blow to feudalism. The feudal economic system began to decline from the time of the Black Death onwards, and it took another major cataclysmic event in Europe, which was the 30 Years' War, also associated with epidemics, to finally finish off the feudal system and produce the capitalist system. So that's one point. Then I would like to make a statement more about not the shape of things to come, but the shape of things we'd like to come. And there we have to speak about modes of production and, broadly speaking, our capitalist mode of production. We know that it's a very powerful mode of production, and we know that it will deliver a great deal of output and has produced a huge increase in the standard of living, notwithstanding the fact that developing countries have fallen behind. But we have to speak about the biggest problem that capitalism produces, which is inequality. Now here, with inequality, what is it about inequality which is wrong? I think most people would agree that at least that part of inequality which produces inequality of opportunity, allowing some inequality for different degrees of effort, different risk-taking, we can allow for that. But inequality of opportunity, which means people cannot advance themselves through their effort or are discriminated against, is immoral. Okay, so what does the entire systemic approach tell us? Because this is a time to really reappraise the system. Well, according to some colleagues in economics, such as Branko Milanovic, they might be waves of inequality. In other words, they are called waves where inequality is increasing, then decreasing, and then rising again. One thing we do observe is that inequality seems to increase during phases of accelerated economic globalization, both in the 19th century and at present, okay? But on the other hand, between the two world wars, but especially after the Second World War, we witnessed something called the Golden Age of Capitalism. There was increased globalization, but not like what we have seen since 1980. And this period was also a period of declining inequality, greater social protection, greater social mobility, full employment, rising standards of living. But since 1980, from about 2000, we have seen different things happening. So we have seen greater inequality, for which usually globalization and technical progress is blamed, and it results in precarious work. And those are the people who are being very hard hit by the pandemic, starting from workers who work without contracts, daily workers in developing countries, as well as workers without employment protection or without contractual employment in the developed world. In that sense, both the developed and developing world are converging. So we have to keep that in mind. So what are we going to do as far as the future is concerned? Arzu Kipris spoke about, the gathering of power by the state, but the state is trying to cover up its failure to deal with adequately with the pandemic, which varies in intensity across countries, right? So that's one thing which may give us a possibility to bring about some positive change. So we have to basically harness the positive side of capitalism. Let's not forget that the economic system also has gone through phases where things have improved, standards of living have improved. So we have to harness that positive side. Think about redistribution, think about, technology which will be more favorable to workers. This is not totally impossible, and I can come back to it in question time. And we have to manage globalization. We cannot just eschew it. So one of the downsides of excessive globalization and the inequality related to it, the two phenomena are connected, was that there was a growth of this populist politics. And what Arzu was speaking about, the populists have nowadays turned into, great dictators and are concentrating more and more power. So this is a time where we have to address the democratic deficits that we have, as well as harnessing the direction of the capitalist mode of production, which is here to stay, unfortunately. And I'd just like to conclude by saying that, look, inequality is important, particularly from the point of view of peace scientists, because inequality is the mother and father of all conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mansoop. Thank you, and for giving an historical sketch, because this reminds us that history of humankind has been characterized by different and also large number of shocks. I keep using this word. I think we have to remember this also to take some lessons from the past. Anyway, now let's go to Andrea Ruggeri. Andrea Ruggeri is professor at the University of Oxford. Some of you would remember him because he has been the last professor, guest of the last meeting of CESPIC in presence before the earthquake in November and before the COVID. So to some extent is a pleasure to host him again in CESPIC meeting. Let's hope that will be a good luck invitation. Andrea, you are a professor of international relations. And so now we cannot ignore that something is going to happen, and the relationship between states cannot be the same after that. Some cooperation may be strengthened under the umbrella of World Health Organization, but we also see that leaders are keeping hostility and rivalries. So in your perspective, so what we have to wait for in international scenarios?
So thank you very much, Raul and CESPIC, for inviting me. I hope you can hear me, and I'm gonna spend 6 minutes just on a couple of points, and very related to what Raul asked me. I want to just make a point that empirically, we have very little to use at this moment. So I'm going to be very self-contained to make any strong, bold statement based on any empirics. And I think we should be very careful at this moment to make any evaluation based on empirics. However, we can actually think more theoretically on some elements that we need to focus. So as Raul said, I think COVID should be understood as a shock. It is highlighting some limitation of the international system, some incapacities, but also highlighting some aspects that we were thought as given. So the first point I want to make is about the role of borders and frontiers. So I think many of us, for many years, have been traveling between countries, have been catching flights without really giving a hard thought how lucky we were and how interdependent we are. Now the borders became again extremely hard and rigid. It's also true that this is perhaps a more Eurocentric point of view, or let me say global north point of view, in the sense that in other countries, borders are still very firm and rigid. And now there is a part of the global citizenship that is actually experiencing what other countries have been experiencing for years. The second point is actually the idea of having to face global collective action problems. So we have borders coming back, but we are facing an issue that we cannot face and tackle without global cooperation. And this is becoming very evident. Todd Sandler used to talk about global collective action problem and think about climate change or international pollution. Here, health and global health, given the level of interdependence, is coming in a very violent way. And is not any longer just a domestic problem. And actually, you cannot just close the borders to avoid the diffusion of this possible issue. However, we have, as an international community, developed some way to deal with this global collective action problem. And these are international organizations. However, we are facing, I would say, a very demanding test to international organization. The WHO has been coping, however, has been also reacting more than being proactive. And this is a point I will make later about the relationship with the WHO and, for instance, China and the sharing of information and being very quick in reacting. So the United Nations and the WHO have been clearly challenged by this very difficult situation. The other, I see that the chat is saying that there is a funny echo. I'm going to try to put these funny headphones, so maybe the echo is not coming back. So the other point, now. So the other point is that it's not just the WHO, it's the European Union. The European Union, in a moment where it would be extremely necessary to coordinate and converge, is really struggling to find a fast reaction. Interestingly enough, the COVID is showing us how there are short-term interests, for instance, electoral cycles, that are really clashing with the long-term interest of the community at large. I can make it explicit looking at the Dutch debate and the difficulty to converge, for instance, toward some policy with other countries. But also the idea that we are facing politics as routine. This is not routine. And maybe the idea that we have to stick to certain rules that we agreed upon, but now are not helping to preserve our collaboration can be problematic. The last point I want to make is, are these superpowers really powerful? So what has been the role of China? What has been the role of USA? And somehow the role of Russia? Clearly, most of us were expecting or thought that China and US were much stronger, more capable to react. For some aspect, China, and I think this talks a lot with what Arzu was saying, internal domestic politics had to delay information sharing with international community. And this is a crucial point because what happened in Italy, in Europe, and then another country is quite related to the political survival of a Chinese elite. But to a certain extent, China has also tried to use this opportunity to leverage and project power in countries where actually their international alliances and allegiances are less firm than previously. So again, if you think about the role of China in Italy providing some aid. And what about the US? The US have played, and maybe here there is a lot to say also about the agency of the president, have really limited their power projection. They have not been so proactive in supporting and balancing, if we use the term of balancing of power, the role of China. So just to conclude, we have to think that as individuals, we have somehow, and I think mostly what we call the global north, rediscover the role of frontiers. As countries, we start to agree that clearly there is the necessity to coordinate. However, we are failing within those entities we created to coordinate sovereign nationally as international organization like EU and WHO to provide solution to actually this global crisis. What about superpowers? You know, is there really an hegemon who is trying to resolve the collective action problem? And it seems in this moment, the answer is there is not clear hegemon. China is struggling to be hegemon, but has been failing to actually protect possible allies. And he's actually using some rhetoric narrative to try to hide some of those mistakes. The US, in a moment of massive withdrawal from NATO, United Nations, is actually more focused internally. In Italy, there have been cases, if you think about that, the American bought masks in the moment there were no masks in Italy. And we know the president of the US actually has bought the possible antivirus from some pharmaceutical companies, just mostly for electoral interest. Therefore, COVID is a shock that is shockingly showing that we are seeing international crisis, but this international crisis cannot be resolved by the classic hegemon, and the international organization, unfortunately, are really struggling to cope in this moment.
Thanks, Andrea. So, in sum, what we have heard, a failure of democracies, a rising inequality, and a lack of international collective actions. So the future appears to be really a matter of concern. But I would like to start the second round of questions with, of course, with Arzu. But I would like to start with this question, Arzu. You say that, of course, leaders, governments are trying to limit civic rights, liberties of people. But the question is, are people going to adapt or are people going to react? That's a big question, I think, in the sense that someone maintains that the fear of disease, the fear of pandemic, has also generated some kind of silent acceptance of leaders' choices. So, in your perspective, what's going to happen in the medium term? Are people going to adapt their belief, understanding that democracy is at risk, or are going to keep their belief, thinking that the countries are just facing an emergency?
Unfortunately, I am not really optimistic about a move towards democratization in the short or medium term. And I'm not expecting, I'm expecting people if I'm to use your words, I'm expecting people to adapt in the short run and in the medium run as well. What's going to happen in the long run? Well, to be honest, we're terribly, terribly bad in predicting such movements, when and where they're going to happen. In the long run, yes, probably things will change, but where people are going to object to such authoritarian measures, it's hard to tell where and when. As Mansoub said, these authoritarian measures and moves are just preemptive decisions taken by governments in order to avoid responsibility and accountability, because we know from empirical studies that people cut the bill to those in charge when such things happen. When bad things happen, we go, and if we can, of course, at the ballot box, we punish those in charge. That's what happens in the short run, that we know. But these guys are acting preemptively in order to prevent people to do that. So once this is over, even if we want to hold the governments accountable, we won't be able to do that. In some parts of the world that I mentioned. They have already thought about this. Those guys in governments, they thought about this, and they're taking preemptive action to prevent people from cutting the bill. So, so in the short run, not much is going to change. And as I said, there's a significant risk that the loss in liberties and rights is going to stay. I'm not much optimistic about the medium run either, but in the long run, as I said, it's very difficult to say. Of course, things will change in the long run, but this rise of authoritarianism is not something new, is not an offspring of the coronavirus. It was there. The coronavirus just strengthened it, just gave it a further push, which is very unfortunate. But that's what happened.
Okay, Arju, I do agree with you. In my perspective, for example, authoritarianism start rising again after the 2008 big crisis, because it was another shock that made people more demanding about economic needs and not about civil rights. Anyway, let's go to Mansoub. Mansoub, I have another an unconventional question for you. Because you speak about inequality, sometimes I feel very concerned about inequality. You know why? Because the Nazi regime in the 20th century, the bloodiest, perhaps the bloodiest regime in history, at least in Europe, was a government that Hitler was a leader committed to reduce inequality. So my concern is that fighting inequality, which is, in our perspective as economists, is something which has to be done. But my concern is that leaders can use this argument also to keep removing rights for people. So what do you think about?
Thank you, Raul. I also liked Arzu's intervention, and I'd just like to say that given my age, I like to think of things which might happen even beyond my lifetime. I do agree with what you've just said and your analysis of the Nazi regime. And it is very true that in the first few years of the Nazi regime, that the regime did manage to bring about greater employment, and through that mechanism reduced inequality. But it did absolutely nothing to address structural issues. And what we have at the moment is probably we are at the cusp of a long run change in the system. And I feel optimistic about one thing, and that is that I think the cycle of inequality increasing throughout the globe, across countries, as well as the global metric of inequality, might probably be peaking, at least. And it's going to increase on impact of the pandemic because of labor-saving technical progress. And in the future, there will be a different kind of labor market, which we cannot visualize. There has always been labor-saving technical progress, and people have always thought jobs will disappear forever. But new types of employment emerge. But we have to think of creative ways that might be used by future generations to address this problem of inequality, including the fact that remuneration might be based upon shares of capital rather than wages, including the fact that there might be great taxes on huge amounts of wealth. And there are historical precedents for this. I mean, what Arzu is saying is absolutely right. Following the Black Death of the 14th century, the feudal lords tried to strengthen their position by introducing new, even more draconian laws to enshrine the feudal system. But in the long run, over 2 centuries, that failed. But I agree that there is going to be that degree of that sort of problem. And populism, which is the flip side of inequality, because the reaction to inequality is to elect populist governments who profess to address this inequality but are not addressing the structural problems, and that the structural problems in history are only addressed through organic factors and not just by the reactive leaders who are essentially populists and who are concentrating more power, who are undermining democracy. And in the medium run, which is 5 years, we might even see increase in inequality, an increase even in absolute poverty, and more power being concentrated both by democracies and by populist leaders elected through democratic processes. In the developing world, we are going to see the rise of greater developmental autocracy. So they will say, we are delivering development to you, but please don't question some of our methods, and acquiescence by the public. But this will not remain forever. This is my view. This is my view, taking a long run perspective. Thank you, Raul.
Thank you, Mansoop. Now I have a question for Andrea. Andrea, you spoke about US and China, and you stated explicitly that China failed, till now at least, failed to become an hegemon because they are not able to protect clients and allies. That's a big point. That's a very big point. So my question is whether this. I have 2 questions, honestly. So the first is whether this COVID is going to decrease the expectation Chinese allies have about the capacity of China to become a leader, a hegemon too. And I have another question, a quick question about US. In November there will be elections. Do you expect any discontinuity in international approach, whatever it's the outcome, or you think that Donald Trump is keeping this, if elected again, Donald Trump is keeping this approach to international community, and what's going to happen with Biden? Quickly, of course. Thanks.
Right, thank you. So yeah, on China, I wanted to stress a bit the point. Well, we know that he's not an hegemon looking at different data in the sense that, there is a very interesting article by the Gili brothers that they showed that militarily China cannot at this moment overcome the military might of the US. But also if you look at other indicators, China is still not a hegemon. I think your point, what's going to happen and what are the expectations of possible allies, and we're not talking, classic allies. I think the most interesting allies are allies like Italy or other countries, in the sense that allies that historically were not Chinese allied. Well, it really depends, I think, on A, what the European Union is able to deliver and do, and B, what the US can do. On the first point, we are still seeing the bargaining, so we don't know. So if, as you know, I think in the top 5 sea herbivores in the world, most are Chinese. And in the Europe, I think one of the few is from the Netherlands and then from Belgium. So if the European Union is able to understand that this is an opportunity actually to recompact the European front, maybe China will not be so strong. However, Chinese are playing a very long game. Then I said it depends on the US as well. Again, I'm not an expert on US foreign policy, but frankly, the withdrawing from the international community is not something that belongs only to Donald Trump. What belongs to Donald Trump is the style, the violence of the terms, and sometimes the oversimplification of international politics. But already from the Obama administration, that sometimes we mistake as, a Woodrow Wilson in terms of international politics, but also Obama was thinking to take a more humble perspective in international politics, withdrawing soldiers and withdrawing intervention, and perhaps delegating. This is a big difference. Obama wanted to delegate more global collective action problem to the United Nations, whereas Trump is less inclined. So I don't know what's going to happen in the November elections. However, I think agency president explained some variation on foreign policy, but the US foreign policy has been, at least in the relationship with Europe and some coalition, withdrawing. It would be interesting to see how they will behave, for instance, more with Asian allies. But it's very hard to predict massive change as a function of outcome, either Republican or Democrats.
So time is running out, so we have just the last super quick round. I'll pose you the same question to you all. Arzu, Mansoub, and Andrea will reply in this order, unmuting themselves. And so my question is for you all is, what are the first 3 priorities to handle this situation? The first 3, we have a bunch of priorities, but the first 3 priorities to face this gloomy future that appears to take shape nowadays. Arzu.
Priorities. Well, as I said, I mean, it doesn't have to be a trade-off between public health and liberties and freedoms and democracy. So that's one priority. And similarly, it doesn't have to be a trade-off between public health and social welfare. It doesn't have to be a trade-off between public health and economic development. So these are the priorities. It doesn't have to be a trade-off between public health and globalization. Just the other day, Donald Trump said that this pandemic shows that globalization is dead. It doesn't have to be that. So the priority is to get rid of such trade-offs or that kind of a mindset, that we need to find ways to have these things simultaneously, to focus on these things simultaneously. And regardless of the emergency situation, we have to make sure that our governments remain accountable. That's another priority. Otherwise, we're losing big. We're really losing big.
Thank you, Arzu. Mansoub?
Thank you, Raul. I would say three things. Eschew, avoid fiscal austerity. Let's not be fooled by any politician who is pushing us towards fiscal austerity, for the simple reason that the world is awash with excess savings, and government bonds, particularly government bonds of the richer countries and emerging market economies, are attractive investment options. So spending by the government should not be a problem, and we should point that out. And we should not use, the size of the public debt or the current budget deficit as an excuse. Second, we have to preserve employment of particularly of the more vulnerable citizens across the world, which means we have to also, a corollary of that, which means we have to relax our phobia with migration, international migration. Three, following what Arzu said, state failure. I would like to say that we should point out the failure of the state in many aspects, both in addressing the pandemic, but also managing the pandemic and managing the economy which follows the pandemic. And in this way, we can maintain accountability of the state. Those are the 3 points I would like to raise. I would like to flag, as it were, Raul. Thank you.
Thank you, Mansoub. Andrea?
So I think what the other colleagues said are very crucial points. I'm going to try to make it more explicit. One, and again, I work in the UK. Now I'm stuck in Italy because I was in Italy for the lockdown. I think one lesson that we have to learn is that health has to be a central public good delivered by the state. So that is something that, and is aspect. Let's be careful about austerity and other aspects, because actually the state does not just provide security, but also one of the major aspects is providing public health and support. The second is that, as I said, we cannot just delegate everything to the state as a country, and the role of international organizations, and especially I think the European Union, but also WHO, they should try to assess what have been the mistakes. I don't think there has been, at least yet, a systematic evaluation of what went wrong with the WHO. And therefore, one of the first things we have to do is that what went wrong and how can we avoid again something like that. And finally, we have to be careful on, at least from my perspective, to have a global north just point of view, and think about, countries such as France, Italy, Spain, the UK, the US are struggling with this emergency. Countries in the global south could have massive effect. Of course, the demographics are very different and there are different aspects, but we cannot now think that the role of international development and aid can just stay on hold. So I think one priority is to really think how international development and aid programs can continue and can change in order to actually face issues that other colleagues said before about refugees migration, labor force dynamics, and also public health.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. So now we are at the end of this meeting. And first of all, I want to thank our guest, Professor Arzu Kibris from University of Warwick, Professor Mansoud Murshid from Coventry University and Institute of Social Studies of in the NEG, and Professor Andrea Ruggeri from University of Oxford. Thanks for coming, and let's hope to host you again in some of our meetings. Secondly, I want to thank all the people who attended this roundtable, this meeting, and I hope that you appreciate it, you like it. And finally, as CESPIC director, I would like only to highlight that we are going to organize other of these meetings in the future in order to shed some light on this, on the shape of things to come. Anyway, thank you to everybody, and let's see next. A big bye-bye from CESPIC and Zoya Keshitemire, Kachuk University, Our Lady of Good Counsel. Bye-bye.